Okay, so I'm on a college campus in the middle of summer. It's not even freaking August yet, but here we are. This is my dorm. My roommate's out right now, so I decided I would just start recording. And today I want to talk about the evolutionary aspects of suicide. So, suicidal behavior should be a threat to humanity as a species, since death ends all possibility of reproduction. So, in theory, people shouldn't have the ability to intentionally kill themselves, and suicide shouldn't have survived natural selection. In this video, I'm going to explain why we've evolved an ability to commit suicide, and how self-killing fits in the grand scheme of human evolution. I'm going to be using Soper's framework to do this. Soper is an evolutionary psychologist. He currently holds the most promising theory for the evolutionary origins of suicide. And I haven't seen too many videos on YouTube talking about it, so I wanted to make my own educational video, breaking down his work in layman's terms. To start with some background, as of 2024, over 700,000 people kill themselves annually, which makes up around 1.5% of deaths. So 1.5% of people who die by suicide. Suicide is a public health issue globally, and it has been for tens of thousands of years, ever since humans evolved both the intelligence and the biological defenses to actively live with it. To understand the evolutionary origins of suicide, we first need to use the pain-brain theory to understand suicide as a mechanism. Essentially, our minds and bodies house two elements which produce suicide, those being pain and intelligence. I'm going to go into these two elements in depth. The first element, pain, is a very important tool. It exists to alert an organism of some condition which jeopardized its ancestors' reproductive chances, and by proxy is endangering the current organism's chances. Let's say you step on a thorn. The pain of that would motivate you to end that painful state. In this case, you'd probably remove the thorn from your skin to alleviate your condition. Everyone's physical and even social pain is backed by our ancestors' previous suffering, which has been forever stored in our genes. So let's say the people who pulled the thorn out of their feet tended to reproduce more successfully than those who kept walking and eventually crippled themselves. This is an example of how pain has evolved as a protective mechanism. Nearly everyone has at least one last resort method to ending pain. That last resort is suicide. Suicide is the inevitable byproduct of painful tension. And by pain, that can vary from literal physical pain to psychosocial pain. Our bodies demand that we do something to end pain or otherwise escape pain. That's what our ancestors and their genes programmed us to do. And since you can't feel anything when you're dead, technically, death is a method of ending your ability to feel bad. At first, this might seem counterintuitive, because most of the time, dying sounds like the most painful thing ever. Why would our bodies be programmed to end pain with, in a sense, more immediate pain? Even if your mind is thinking long-term, and you realize that, in the long run, suicide would be an end to all forms of pain, logically, your body shouldn't be able to let you kill yourself in its efforts to avoid pain. To explain how humans have this ability to commit suicide, I'm going to use an example from The Evolution of Life Worth Living. The human organism is caught between their phenotype and their genotype. The phenotype is the physical body, and the genotype is the genetic code of the physical body. We'll treat these two things, phenotype and genotype, like characters in a play. Phenotype and genotype need each other. Phenotype can't survive without genotype's operating instructions. Genotype can't replicate its genes without phenotype's physical, reproductive equipment. Phenotype is the only one in this pair that can feel pain. So at times, suicide has an absurd, unrealistic appeal. Phenotype was unintentionally programmed this way by genotype. On the other hand, suicide is disastrous for genotype, because death ends all future prospects of reproduction/replication. If there's no other method of ending unbearable physical or otherwise psychological pain, the human organism must choose to obey either phenotype or genotype. Obeying phenotype results in the organism's death. Obeying genotype results in a prolonged suffering, but the continuation of living. Pain is a constant battle of biological needs, and suicide functions as a pain-relieving mechanism. Before I proceed with the rest of the video, I wanted to do a PSA of sorts. I know it's kind of obvious when my eyes are reading from line to line, but bear with me. I want to get this right, and I did write it. It is genuinely coming from me. And I want to get it right, so we're just going to start with that. I just wanted to ask that you don't use this video or any of my other content to hurt yourself. I know as long as this is on YouTube, there will be a risk of people doing that. And it's something I worry about because I know it's a thing. I know that for however long this is going to be on the internet, there's a strong possibility that someone will hurt themselves while watching this. The topic of this video is already a risk factor in and of itself, and I really don't want it to be. I don't want this video to contribute to the permanent scarring on someone's body, or like the normalization of self-harm within their minds. That also applies to the other infographic on this channel, which talks about the neurobiology of suicide. I know this might seem long and disclaimatory. Disclaimatory is not a freaking word, but we're going to use it here. I know this might seem long and disclaimatory to some of you watching this, but I felt it necessary to add this in the middle of my recordings. I want these videos to be informational and possibly help some people understand why they exhibit certain behaviors. If you're considering hurting yourself or doing it later today, sleep on it or wait until you're around someone who can hold you accountable. And I know that doesn't mean shit, but if this video is pushing you towards that mindset, that state of mind, that behavior, please, feel free to click off and do something to make yourself feel better. I now want to move on to the other element of the pain-brain theory which produces suicide, that being human intelligence. If pain is the motivation, then intelligence is the means. There are 3 demographics who haven't been known to commit suicide, those being non-human animals, the severely intellectually disabled, and children under the age of 5 or 6. I want you to think of suicide as a cognitive challenge. Very young children have no meaningful concept of death. And even as they age, it still takes years for them to get the whole picture. As an adolescent, you would have needed to develop certain cognitive skills to understand death, like the ability to grasp its permanence, or the ability to mentally project forward and back in time. And most importantly, you would have needed the ability to apply death to yourself. You would have needed to have developed an understanding that death is universal, and you too will die someday. Understanding suicide is a little different. The ability to grasp suicide comes and goes at different stages of cognitive maturation, or maturity. That is why, as you can see on this graph, there's a spike in adolescent deaths by suicide. The surge at around age 10 indicates when the brightest become smart enough to both conceive of their mortality and act on that knowledge, given that they have the painful motive to do so. From that point onward, the curve reflects the different ages at which children in pain have gained the intellectual means for suicide. The intellectual threshold for suicide is measured by orders of intentionality. So normally, your mind has 2 degrees of intentionality, the first being the contents of your own mind, and the second being the contents of someone else's mind. As you can imagine, those degrees and orders can pile up quick. For instance, I could be thinking about whether you know if Mary has asked Peter to not tell James about the party. That's a very convoluted example, but you get the idea. That sentence includes first, second, third, fourth, and fifth orders of intentionality. In terms of suicide, if you are capable of the third or fourth order, then you're pretty much capable of killing yourself. As you can see here, virtually everyone has capability for this first order of thinking. I hurt. That's basic. That's animalistic. The second order of intentionality, in terms of suicide, is the self-awareness of being hurt, rather than the feeling itself. Suicide potential begins at the third order of intentionality, because it's the beginning of the search to end that pain. It's being aware 3 times over. Fourth order of intentionality is more of the realization that suicide is technically a method of ending pain. Don't get me wrong, this line of reasoning is very delusional and misguided, but it's also what I believe to be the thought process behind suicidal behavior. Again, if you have the cognitive skill to grasp death in full, combined with the ability for third and fourth order thinking, then you are fully capable of suicide. This is also why the 3 demographics I mentioned earlier, non-human animals, the very young children of whatever our population, and the severely intellectually disabled are protected populations from suicide, because they don't have the skills necessary to think of it. So that was the intellectual threshold for suicide. I now want to go more into how suicide originated in our evolution, since there was a point where we weren't smart enough to think of suicide as a possibility for ourselves. There's a concept called the fitness ceiling to explain how suicide evolved into a human mechanism, and it's accompanied by a graph which I'll showcase in a bit. To understand the fitness ceiling and the aforementioned graph, we first need to understand adaptation. Adaptation is a biological trait which evolved by selection to solve a fitness problem in a species' evolutionary past. When I use the term fitness in that statement, I'm not talking about physical fitness or exercise. I'm talking about how successfully a species reproduces. Looking at this image, you can see that the brown beetles have more offspring than the green ones, because they've been doing a better job at surviving and shit. So the brown beetles have a higher fitness, the green beetles have a lower fitness, etc., and so on. At a point, certain adaptive traits lose their original survival advantage as they continually develop to the point of exaggeration. So there's a fitness ceiling for when a trait undermines its reproductive benefits. So in theory, when it came to suicide, humans had a fitness ceiling of intelligence. Think of it like this. There's a usual variability of fitness traits which creates a bell curve. This is to convey that some people used to be and are more intelligent than others, just as some are less intelligent than others now. But the spread is random and more or less creates a normal distribution. Most people fall towards the middle, again being more or less than average, with a diminishing minority trailing off towards the high and low extremes. But at some point in our evolution, being smart must have stopped being beneficial to our reproductive prospects. Because intelligence in an animal, to our extent anyway, produces suicide. Basically, any animal that realized it didn't have to suffer in pain would freaking jump at the opportunity to kill itself. So the fitness cost of being smarter should have stopped being worth paying. So how have we surpassed this fitness ceiling? To answer that question, I've got a graph for some visuals. Here we have 3 miniature bell curves on different levels from each other. As you can see, the fitness ceiling of intelligence is beginning to look more like a cliff, so we'll call it the cliff edge of suicide. Before we developed the anti-suicide defenses to actively survive with self-killing as a possibility, if an organism went beyond the cliff edge, then their germline disappeared. By the way, the anti-suicide defenses that I just mentioned are common mental disorders. I covered that part of the theory in my last video, and I'll cover it again later in this one, but for now, bear with me whenever I use the phrase anti-suicide defenses. If the bell curve is completely behind the cliff, then the entire breeding population is well away from the edge, protecting the minorities in the forward-facing tail by proxy. The only reason the forward-facing minorities would be protected like this is because if they survive and reproduce, then their offspring will populate the main body of the bell curve. Their reproductive success impacts the whole populace. So in some way, our ancestors must have come against the ceiling long enough for them to have evolved anti-suicide adaptations, which made suicide, or at least the threat of suicide, generally survivable for most of the species. So how is this possible? Well, here's what might have happened. Selection pushed early human intelligence close enough to the edge for where it was just survivable. Human intelligence was then held there for many, many generations. Over these generations, the occasional genetic mutation had an anti-suicide effect, which was spread all throughout the population. On average, people didn't benefit from these adaptations. The average person was far from the cliff edge, too far from the cliff edge to enjoy it. But the minorities who were around the cliff edge enjoyed the adaptations, and in consequence, they survived long enough to reproduce. As cognizance beyond the threshold for suicide became more and more survivable, the population's average intelligence rose. The bell curve was squeezed closer to the edge, and even more minorities were pushed beyond the cliff/intellectual threshold. This elevated the need for more anti-suicide adaptations, continuing the cycle for thousands of generations, thousands and thousands of times over, until we ended up here. Although a steady percentage of us have consistently fallen victim to self-killing, we're all equipped with anti-suicide defenses in our modern day, because of the generations which surpassed the cliff edge of suicide. All of this leads me to my next topic, which is explaining and defining anti-suicide defenses. Self-killing has been a recurring fitness hazard in human evolution, which we've evidently worked around. So suicidality must be paired with an adaptation, which just so happens to be common mental disorders. Disorders like depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, substance abuse, etc. Although mental illness very much contributes to suicide rates and psychache, the pain-brain theory posits that common mental disorders originally evolved to prevent suicide. They do this by either lessening pain or lessening the intelligence required to kill yourself. According to Soper, mental disorders are so specifically tailored towards a preventative function that they had to have evolved to be anti-suicide defenses. As an analogy, let's say you didn't know what an accordion is. Let's say I gave you one, and I asked you what it was made for. You'd probably see the keyboard and the shoulder strap, and you'd figure out that it was designed to make music. You can do something very similar with biological features. For example, you could study the heart and quickly figure out that it's evolved for pumping blood. There's no better explanation. So I'm going to list a multitude of reasons for why common mental disorders evolved as anti-suicide defenses. One is that we experience these disorders because of some form of psychological pain, which is usually caused by problems in our social lives. So grief, abuse, isolation, stressors, failure, things like that. Connecting to my next point, 2 is that mental disorders are origin blind. It doesn't matter what type of psychological pain is experienced. Pain is pain, and your body can't read your specific thoughts like that. Although your consciousness is housed by the brain itself doesn't communicate with a train of thought. It communicates via a neuroendocrine system of hormones, chemical messengers which are emotion. Emotions have evolved as internal signals, which the central nervous system uses to select the best behavior in a given situation, like fight or flight. So our brain isn't following the words and ideas we think in. It's like listening to music in a language you don't know. You may not understand the lyrics, but you can understand the mood the song's going for. In the same manner, the central nervous system, or nervous system in general, has evolved to react to strong, long-lasting psychological pain as if it were a suicide threat. That's why mental disorders are triggered regardless of suicidality. That's also why mental disorders are pathological, which is my third point. Most people begin mental disorders suffering, but not suicidal, and later become suicidal the longer that they stay mentally ill. The majority of mentally ill people aren't even suicidal, by the way, but that only strengthens the argument for mental disorders being both a self-killing preventative and an unintentional pathology. The fourth reason disorders have a protective function relates to adolescence. Just as suicides are virtually non-existent among very young children, common mental disorders are extremely rare among kids below a certain age. In fact, the peak age for first arrival of mental disorders is adolescence. This aligns with the intellectual threshold for suicide, which happens to bring me to my fifth point. Mental disorders either do something to lessen the pain or the intelligence needed for suicide, fitting into the pain-brain theory. For example, depression, substance abuse, self-harm, they all either do something to numb or redirect pain. Someone who's depressed may become so numb, they won't have the motivation or the energy to get out of bed, let alone leave their house or kill themselves. And for self-harm specifically, it doesn't have to be an active suicide attempt, because most acts of self-harm are just super bad coping mechanisms. I've used this example before, but I'll say it again. Non-suicidal self-harm is just, it's very commonly used to redirect pain. So like, let's say you bite your lip after stubbing your toe on something. By applying a secondary, unrelated stimulus, you're directing feeling away from an even bigger pain. So people with self-harm disorders try to relieve their mental pain by inflicting physical pain. It's a secondary stimulus that takes attention away from whatever's going wrong psychologically. As for the lessening of intelligence, mental disorders are notorious for debilitating cognitive functions. Neurological studies of depression show that the brains of those impacted floods parts of itself with useless information, causing processing to slow down. I'm bringing up depression a lot, but it's one of, if not the most common mental disorder. So most people who kill themselves have it, and it does a number on both the pain and brain aspects of suicidality. Anyways, people with depression, eating disorders, bipolar personality, schizophrenia, they all gain cognitive deficits, struggling with things such as formation, and the retrieval of memories. Those are the most prevalent points pointing towards common mental disorders having a suicide preventative design. I could keep going, but I think I hit the high points on Soper's pain-brain theory, so I now want to move on to some counterarguments I've come across. To begin, there's a few statistical issues with the mental disorder defense model. According to the pain-brain theory, lower suicide rates must be accompanied by higher rates of common mental disorders, i.e., anti-suicide defenses. So, for example, let's say demographic A has a lower rate of suicide than demographic B. This means demographic A must have a higher rate of anti-suicide defenses, causing these lower suicide rates. This doesn't align with real life. Looking at rates by gender, men have a higher rate of severe common mental disorders than women, especially when including psychotic symptoms. However, these higher rates of disorders aren't doing anything to lessen men's suicide rates. Women not only have lower rates of anti-suicide defenses, but they also have a lower suicide rate than men. So I didn't actually tailor those previous bar charts to scale. I just needed to create something to better conceptualize what I'm talking about. It's low-key lazy and embarrassing, and I'm not proud of it. So I do have some actual statistically accurate stats to prove my point, which you can see on screen. It is generally known that men die to suicide more often than women. Granted, women are more likely to make an attempt, but they tend to use lower lethality methods, which may be indicative of the anti-suicide defenses messing with their cognitive functions. So overall, they do die less often. This is also very generally known in the fields of suicidology. Women make more attempts, men die more often. Here's another chart demonstrating that men kill themselves more often than women. And here's a chart that I made proving that men, empirically anyway, have a higher rate of anti-suicide defenses at work than women, on a global level. All of these stats will be linked in the description. The bar in dark blue was actually an average out of 56 to 69%, so the difference between men and women may be even greater than initially thought. So this doesn't align with Cass Soper's theory. By his logic, because women have a lower rate of anti-suicide defenses than men, they should be dying more often than men. Although women do have higher rates of depression, eating disorders, and anxiety specifically, anxiety was excluded as an anti-suicide defense by Cass Soper, under the assumption that it has its own separate origin. So the point still stands. According to the theory, women should be committing suicide more often than men. None of this completely negates the anti-suicide defense model, but it does make it the least supported part of the theory. This also raises the question as to how rates are reduced in women without the use of severe mental disorders. This next critique is going to be a bit personal, but I have read a bunch of Soper's works, critiques of his work, and at this point, I've done an unhealthy amount of research on suicide as a topic, so I do think my takes have some objective value. So keep watching. The pain brain theory posits that because anti-suicide defenses are super costly to activate, they're literally mental disorders. Your body doesn't want that. They're so costly to activate that they probably have defenses of their own called fenders. So basically, at a certain point, the book becomes all about how literally everything was formed by suicide in our evolution and preventing it, including religion and happiness. That's why it's titled The Evolution of Life Worth Living, Why We Choose to Live. I don't buy it, but I'll get into that in a bit. So, Soper argues that because we're the only animals on Earth who had to have evolved our irrational, species-specific happiness, it's all because of the fact that we have the intelligence for suicide. The same goes for our belief in gods and general benevolence. If we didn't, there'd be too much of a risk of us committing suicide. Soper created this whole system for categories of our delusions and optimism and spiritual beliefs. But I don't believe that that many things, especially concepts as big as spirituality and happiness and love, were fully evolved from a threat of suicide. I agree with everything else that he talks about. How suicide has a pain-relieving function, how early humans survived to develop a greater intelligence by evolving anti-suicide adaptations. But I don't believe people have hobbies because they've evolved to prevent mental disorders, which is something he argues for in Chapter 9. Cass Soper claims that humans' biological foundation for love is that we treat others the way we want to be treated. When people love someone unconditionally, they're trying to love a projection of themselves. They want to believe there's a benign higher order in the universe, whether it be God or, for atheists, unconditional love. Paradoxically, this kind of treatment does create a benign order of sorts, just on a more human level. I agree with this idea, but I don't agree that this desire for a benevolent outside force has evolved as a survival strategy against suicide. I think those psychosocial phenomenons are far too complex to be watered down as defense mechanisms against self-killing, or micro-behaviors inching us towards reproduction. For my final critique, I'll be talking about arguments against evolutionary psychology as a whole. One of the biggest criticisms of the field is that it gives way too much weight to natural selection. Natural selection isn't the most prominent part of evolution, taking into account things like mutation, recombination, and genetic drift. So, by that logic, a counterargument can be made that suicide doesn't need a function or a mechanism, because suicide is random, just as evolution at large is random. Although I agree that a lot of evolutionary psychology puts way too much emphasis on natural selection, I think suicide is way too specific in its process and mechanism to be random. I'd like to, whoa, I'd like you to think of the accordion analogy again. Looking at the keys and strap on an accordion, you can figure out that it's made for music. Suicide requires a certain level of intelligence specific to human beings, of a cognitive maturity at the threshold of suicide, as evidenced by a lack of deaths and the lacking demographics. Suicide is also always preceded by suffering, with death being a solution as it numbs pain. It numbs any feeling or state of being that you could possibly be conscious of. What better explanation would there be for self-killing? The body demands that you end pain, to the point where last resorts are expected to be in the realm of possibility. And evolutionary psychology may not be a good lens to study things like religion or happiness through, but it is the only lens we have to study suicide, from an evolutionary standpoint anyway. Suicide is a mental phenomenon with a very specific function, so it can be explained as a mechanism by using the field of evopsych. So it does have legitimacy. So this has been the evolutionary aspects of suicide. If you watch through the personal opinion section, I highly appreciate it. I've recorded so many outros. I don't really know what the fuck I'm doing or what the fuck to put here, but I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please read Cass Soper's book. I highly recommend it. It's, like I've said 1,000 times, it's called The Evolution of Life Worth Living, Why We Choose to Live. I linked it in the description as a PDF. It can help so many people. It has helped me, especially with like thinking in terms of behavior. If you struggle with like some sort of mental illness or suicidality, that freaking book will, it'll give you a different perspective at least. Maybe it's not good for everyone. It is morbid to like study things like that while you are struggling with it. I might not necessarily be talking about myself, but like I'm not gonna spill all my personal shit here. But yeah, I'll be making more videos. Please ask me in the comments if you have any questions. I want to talk about this so much more. I want to properly talk to people about this after they've watched it. I want their opinions, or if they've been confused about anything, I want to clarify myself. So please do that.